And now we join NBC News here on 2.
Back on the beat, hundreds of Iraqis volunteer for Baghdad's new police force. Washington threatens sanctions on Syria as Saudi Arabia calls an emergency summit. And controversy and missing faces as Palestine's new Prime Minister Abu Mazen unveils his new cabinet. Hello there, welcome to NBC News on 2. It's 17 hours GMT, I'm David Cass. Washington is considering sanctions against Syria for what it calls its support for members of Saddam Hussein's former government. Secretary of State Colin Powell's warning is expected to be discussed at an emergency regional conference in Saudi Arabia on Friday. An emergency meeting of Gulf Cooperation Council ministers is being held in Riyadh tomorrow.
Dismay across the Arab region, not just about Iraq, but what many are now saying is Washington's next target, Syria. Saudi Arabia's Foreign Minister, Prince Saud al-Faisal, held talks with the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad in Damascus today to discuss Washington's latest allegations. The US claims that Syria has weapons of mass destruction, although the administration hasn't said if they belong to Syria or Iraq. They also claim that they are harboring former Ba'ath Party members. Israel has added its voice to the chorus, claiming that Syria is harboring terrorists.
We know very well what a major role Syria is taking in letting those terrorist organizations to increase their activities. Unfortunately, they're not doing anything in order to prevent it.
Turkey, who once accused Syria of harboring Turkish Kurdish rebels, tried to add some perspective.
There is a great deal of propaganda. Now Iraq, then Syria, and then Iran, and then afterwards some other things. This is very annoying. That is why one has to show that it's not true and that the war has to stay in Iraq.
The European Union's foreign policy chief, Javier Solana, has also urged Washington to tone down its statements against Damascus, echoed by British Foreign Secretary Jack Straw in Bahrain today and in Saudi Arabia on Tuesday.
There are important questions which the Syrians need to answer. So far as is quote Syria next on the list, we have made it clear that it is not. There is no next list, and the Prime Minister, British Prime Minister Blair, in the House of Commons last week said that he knew of no plans for Syria to be quote next on the list.
Julie Studer, NBC News.
The sight of U.S. tanks in Baghdad leaves no doubt President Bush isn't bluffing when it comes to using force. And the president is now making strong allegations about Syria.
I think that we believe there are chemical weapons in Syria, for example, and each situation will require a different response.
They should review their actions and their behavior, not only with respect to who gets haven in Syria and weapons of mass destruction, but especially the support of terrorist activity.
Yesterday, the deputy ambassador said his country wants to cooperate.
And this is just an ongoing series of false accusations. And let me tell you this today. Every day you will have new reports against Syria, accusing Syria of things it has not done.
But policy experts in the United States are skeptical and say Syrian officials are lying.
Right now, we have lots of documentation that there are programs of weapons of mass destruction. We have lots of documentation that there are terrorists operating from their territory. It's not so much that we believe them, because we don't, and I don't. It's they have to believe the Bush administration is serious about this problem.
No one thinks the Bush administration will act quickly against Syria, military force being the option of last resort. But one analyst said, don't be surprised if we see U.S. troops in Damascus in a year. Gabe Caggiano, NBC News, Washington.
Iraqi police have returned to the streets of Baghdad for the first time since the city came under US control. More than 2,000 policemen registered for work in the capital, racked by an orgy of looting and vandalism. Many of those returning to work did not wear uniforms, fearing reprisal attacks by local residents, venting their anger at decades of Saddam's rule, which the police helped enforce. They came to the Baghdad Police Academy in response to a clear need, urged to volunteer by coalition radio and TV broadcasts. Major al-Banda says he's come to save Baghdad from thieves and criminals and expects to do joint patrols with coalition forces. Major al-Banda says he's come to save Baghdad from thieves and criminals and expects to do joint patrols with coalition forces. When the final count comes, some already fear that the cost to Iraq's heritage by its own people will far outweigh the damage wrought by Allied bombs. On Saturday, the museum had been ransacked, with billions of dollars of antiquities smashed or stolen. This was one of the oldest libraries in Baghdad. Inside, priceless manuscripts, left to burn because there's no fire service. Some residents are not overjoyed about the new police force. The same gang has come back, said this man, only Saddam has changed. The Americans are being criticized for not guarding the Chinese embassy properly. Now the diplomatic missions of the major opponents to the war, Germany, France and China, have all been ransacked.
They started robbing. They took everything they could. There were vans and trucks here, and even some Mercedes cars, diplomatic cars. They pulled the licenses off, they took them off, and they started. So, some cars were pulled with tractors even. I've seen them. The tires were totally destroyed. They're pulling them on the wheels.
Sporadic fighting continues around the capital. Lawlessness has to be controlled before residents will trust either American troops or their new police force. American Marines searching Baghdad have found a multi-million-dollar collection of luxury cars beneath the city hall. As the soldiers descended into the basement, they discovered around 20 vehicles parked and in pristine condition. Among the collection was this 1936 custom two-seater Mercedes, a Bentley and several Rolls-Royces. Some of the cars are valued at as much as $10 million. One Marine officer said the find was like something out of a Hollywood movie. It's believed the cars belonged to senior officials in Saddam Hussein's government. Baghdad residents continue to live in fear, a new fear of looting and personal violence, which has replaced the institutional violence with which they say they lived under Saddam Hussein. It's also hindering the work of relief agencies like the International Red Cross. From Baghdad, here's Saad al-Hassani.
People coming from the outskirts of Baghdad and even the center of Baghdad, from places like Saddam City, Sharla, Iskan, among others, have plundered even the bricks of some state buildings. And this has created a state of anger and resentment.
We will hope that it will be finished quickly, because it's a bad thing to see that your country has been stolen.
Stealing and theft, and forcing their way into even hospitals. Such hooligans have made the efforts of the only remaining body working in Iraq, the Red Cross, desperately difficult.
Because of this looting, there are tremendous needs to re-establish social services, medical services, and so infrastructures in the whole country.
Insecurity now is the only thing that keeps families worried. Some of them accuse the US forces for encouraging such hooligans by being indifferent to what they do. Yet the most urgent demand of everyone is a procedure to be taken to keep and maintain discipline and order, and after all, security, which left everyone depend on self-defense.
I'd like to say to my people that we should focus on our country, put ourselves together to rebuild our Baghdad, our country, whole Iraq. We are brave, we are so brave, and we proved that in the ancient time.
Some of the people even think that Saddam Hussein did well by suppressing such hooligans who justify their doing as revenge on Saddam regime. Baghdad, which used to be called the cradle of civilization, had suddenly changed into a coffin of death and a place of destruction where the survival is for the worst. Fear, insecurity and worry This is the state in Baghdad nowadays. Everyone feels quiet, insecure, and everybody wants security and nothing else. Not a government, but an Iraqi government. Everybody was telling me this. Saad al-Hassani, NBC News, Baghdad.
US Marines say they met patchy resistance in Tikrit. Backed by tanks, they stormed into the heart of Saddam Hussein's final stronghold, seizing control of his hometown in possibly the last major military assault of the war. Marine patrols combed a sprawling presidential palace in search of senior supporters of the ousted government. Attack helicopters swooped low over one district, firing heavy machine guns to blast out lingering clusters of do-or-die defenders. US commanders said the fall of Tikrit brought the 26-day military campaign in Iraq to a transition point. Well, with me now is Dr. Mustafa Alani of London's Royal Institute for Strategic Studies. A transitional moment? What is that transition, do you think, Mustafa?
I believe we're facing now major, the start of the new stage of the war. I believe the city war is over, and now it is basically a manhunt war, searching for the search and destroy, basically, searching for the leadership, and basically it's reduced to the war in Afghanistan for the last 18 months.
What chance do you think they have of finding the leadership? We've seen the deck of cards, the 55 cards. Yes. 2 so far are accounted for.
I think there's a good chance, actually. There's two possibilities. Either those people individually hide in their villages, and you have to pick them one by one, or there is an organized hideout. And if you discover it, you have the whole leadership in one place.
Which do you think is the more likely?
I think the organized one, because everybody disappeared in 1 minute, and it is impossible. You see, if they individually, you will pick up, by now, you will pick up many of them. But you have to remember that the two is not really part of the leadership, political leadership. The two, one surrender, one. Yeah. So there's a possibility that they are not able to leave the country, I'm sure.
You think they're still in the country, seriously?
I believe there is no option but to stay in the country.
Allied Central Command, of course, stresses that the fall of Tikrit is not the end of the campaign. But apart from the manhunt that you've described, what militarily is there left to do?
It is what we call cleaning operation. It is a small pocket here and there. But in the major war, the classic sense of the war, I think it is over, because now all the major cities, all the major civilization centers have been basically occupied.
Well, as we discovered about 10 days ago, you yourself are an Iraqi. Yeah. You're sitting here with us day by day, hour by hour, watching the faces. Do you see a distinct change yet in your countrymen and the way they seem to be responding to all of the contact they're having with these American troops and so on?
I think the major problem is uncertainty. They know the regime is now finished, but what's the future? And they believe the real war for the civilian population starts now. The shooting war is over, and it was okay. It was easy, quick, but now actually the intention to dismantle the state, worrying everybody, because the Americans refused to use the police only in a very limited number. So there's a major uncertainty.
You mentioned the police there, very, very briefly.
Yeah.
Are the Allies doing the right thing by hiring members of the former police force?
They have no option but use. Either they have to inject 100 or 200,000, or they have to use the existing forces. So I think this is a matter of necessity rather than of choice.
Dr. Mustafa, thanks very much indeed. Thank you. And that's where we'll take a short break. Coming up later in the program, Tony Blair's promise to the Iraqi people on how they'll choose to run their own country.
في زمن شوهته الحروب تحولت الحياة إلى صراع من أجل البقاء ومن أجل الانتماء.
If English law cannot be trusted, maybe these people would do better making their own peace with the French.
Daniel Day-Lewis, Madeleine Stowe, The Last of the Mohicans. السبت في 10 KSA على 2.
Hello Hello again. You're watching NBC News on 2. Iraqi traffic police have also been summoned to work alongside British troops patrolling Basra. Iraq's second largest city has been without running water, electricity or phone service for nearly 2 weeks, and many buildings there, just like Baghdad, have been looted.
300 former policemen who served under Saddam Hussein turned up for work today at the invitation of the British. It's part of the handing over of self-governance to the Iraqi people.
This is the very first patrol we've mounted today in conjunction with the local police. We're going to try and revalidate them, set up some sort of law and order again. This is the very first building block in a very long process.
I'm standing at checkpoints looking at cars. They are teaching us how to check cars.
The fact that former policemen are being re-employed, however, is eyed with suspicion by those who have suffered at their hands in the past. This family, living on the outskirts of Basra in Hamdan, are still traumatized from their own experiences.
They suspect my brothers of opposing the regime, so they bound our hands and they took us all away. My wife, my children, everyone. They tortured us one by one.
They humiliated us in prison. They took away my children. They took away our dignity. My 9-year-old son was beaten and left to hang from the ceiling. We spent 2 years in prison. We came here because we had nowhere else to go.
Before they were released, Iraqi secret police bulldozed their home. Today they live without running water and electricity in a makeshift house. For them, any officer associated with Saddam Hussein's rule is still a threat to their newfound liberty. Julie Studer, NBC News.
A conference in Beirut has been hearing about the huge financial toll of the war on Arab economies. The United Nations agency, the Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia, said overall productivity is estimated to drop by $400 billion. That's on top of the $600 billion lost since the last Gulf War. The agency also forecasts 2 million job losses. Tony Blair says that Saddam Hussein's army has collapsed across Iraq and that those still fighting against US and British forces are foreigners. The British Prime Minister says Iraq should hold elections for a fully representative government about 12 months after an interim authority is put into place.
We took the decision that to leave Iraq in its brutalized state under Saddam was wrong. Now there is upon us a heavy responsibility to make the peace worth the war. We shall do so. We shall do so not in any spirit of elation, still less of triumphalism, but with a fixed and steady resolve that the cause was just, the victory right, and the future for us to make in a way that will stand the judgment of history.
Live now to London and NBC's John Cookson. John, what do they consider to be the greatest concerns now that the fighting appears to be nearly over?
Well, it's how really to win the peace, and what a job they've got ahead. Elections within a year of the installation of a government, that's a very tall order indeed. Not only do we have the three major factions in Iraq, the Sunni, the Shia and the Kurds, but there are hundreds of other groups within that. And it's going to be a major task to bring all those people together. And just as an example of that, we have this meeting of exiles in Nasiriyah tomorrow, and most of the main players aren't even going, notably Ahmed Chalabi, who's only sending a representative. So a tough job ahead.
What's the spin being put on the current tension between the US and Syria there in London?
Very interesting, because all the signals coming out of Washington are very hard line. Out of London, though, it's softly. And Mr. Hoon, the Defence Secretary today, said that there'd be no invasion of Syria now or in the near future. And Tony Blair echoed that view a little later on when he was talking to Parliament. And don't forget that there are quite strong ties between London and Damascus, and there's no way that Britain would go along with any kind of invasion or even a tough